The courtroom buzzed, not with tension, but with smug satisfaction. Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis leaned back in their chairs, grinning like kings who had once again escaped justice. The judge's voice had barely faded when cheers erupted from their side of the room. Mike clapped Greg on the back. Another day, another win. Greg smirked. They really thought they could take us down. Tom leaned in, his voice laced with arrogance. Man, I love this job. For months, the 3 officers had been under investigation for racial profiling, excessive force, and planting evidence on innocent black citizens. But, as always, their connections in high places had protected them. Witnesses had mysteriously backed out, evidence had vanished, and just like that, case dismissed. Their laughter was a slap in the face to justice. But just as they stood to leave, the courtroom doors swung open. A tall black man in a crisp suit stepped inside, his presence commanding instant silence. His sharp brown eyes scanned the room, locking onto the 3 officers. The judge cleared his throat. Before we adjourn, I have an announcement. As of today, the city has appointed a new chief of police. A hush fell over the courtroom. Please welcome Chief Jamal Brooks. The smirks on their faces vanished. Mike, Greg, and Tom froze in place, their hearts pounding. Jamal Brooks. That name sent a shiver down their spines. They knew him. Years ago, he had been one of their victims. A young black man they had falsely arrested, humiliated, and tossed into a cell for a crime he never committed. Back then, he had been powerless. They had laughed at his pleas, ignored his protests, and buried the truth. And now he was their new boss. Jamal stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his face unreadable. The room remained eerily silent as he studied the 3 men who had once destroyed his life. Gentlemen, he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning, I look forward to working with you. Greg shifted uncomfortably, forcing a stiff smile. It's an honor, Chief. Mike cleared his throat. Yeah, we're ready to serve under your leadership. Jamal said nothing. He simply let the moment stretch, watching them squirm. Then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he spoke again. Good. A pause. Because things are about to change. The weight of those words sank deep. The celebration was over. The next morning, the 3 officers entered the precinct. But something felt off. The usual nods of respect were gone. The air was thick with whispers, glances, and something they had never experienced before, cold indifference. And at the front of the room stood Jamal Brooks. He was in full uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his hands clasped behind his back. His presence alone was enough to command attention. As the room settled, his voice rang out. Reynolds, Carter, Willis. They flinched. Their names no longer carried power. Jamal gestured for them to step forward. Every eye in the room was on them as they obeyed, their usual arrogance replaced by a sense of unease. Without a word, Jamal placed a thick folder on the table. The 3 officers exchanged nervous glances. Inside was everything. Complaints, accusations, hidden reports, buried evidence. Their sins laid bare. Greg's face turned pale. Mike clenched his jaw. Tom's hands curled into fists. You've abused your power for too long, Jamal said, his voice steady. As of today, you are suspended pending an internal investigation. A stunned silence filled the room. Mike took a step forward. You can't do this. Jamal met his gaze, unshaken. I already have. Their reign was crumbling. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines blazed across television screens and newspapers. Corrupt cops suspended. Chief Brooks declares war on injustice. The city erupted. For years, people have been afraid to speak out, knowing the system was rigged against them. But now, the walls were cracking. Community leaders applauded Jamal's actions. Activists took to the streets. Families of victims shed tears of relief. Inside a dimly lit bar, Greg threw a glass against the wall. This is a setup, he growled. Mike, usually the voice of reason, sat quietly, staring at his untouched drink. He has the department behind him, he admitted. They don't fear us anymore. Tom, his anger simmering, slammed his fist on the table. We're not going down like this. But for the first time, The reality was sinking in. This time, they might not win. Jamal didn't waste time. He ordered a full internal review. Files that had been hidden away were unearthed. Cases dismissed without cause were reopened. The truth was finally seeing daylight. More damning than the reports, however, were the witnesses. Citizens who had once been too afraid to speak now lined up, ready to testify. At the precinct, Mike and Greg sat in a dark office, staring at the walls as one by one. The victims stepped forward. False arrests, stolen money, beatings. Each statement was a nail in their coffin. Greg leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "We need a way out." Mike shook his head. "There is no way out." Jamal had played his cards well, and they had nowhere left to run. 2 weeks later, it happened. The same police department that once protected them dragged them from their homes in the dead of night. Handcuffed, arrested, mugshots taken. Journalists flooded the scene, cameras flashing. Protesters gathered outside, cheering as the once untouchable officers were shoved into the back of police cars. Greg gritted his teeth. This isn't over. But as the doors to their cells slammed shut, a harsh truth settled in. Maybe it was. The courtroom was packed. This time, the power dynamic had shifted. The officers who once controlled this room now stood in chains. The prosecutor's voice was firm. "Officer Reynolds, Officer Carter, Officer Willis, you're charged with misconduct, abuse of power, falsifying evidence, and multiple counts of racial discrimination." The weight of their crimes was laid bare, and this time, there would be no escape. The jury returned in 1 hour. The foreman stood. Guilty? The courtroom exploded in cheers. Mike's face drained the color. Greg shook his head in disbelief. Tom muttered curses under his breath. But there was no way out. Justice had finally been served. Jamal didn't stop there. He rebuilt the department from the ground up. For the first time in years, the people of the city felt safe. And Jamal? He was just getting started. As Mike, Greg, and Tom were escorted out of the courtroom, their faces were masks of shock and anger. The cameras captured every second. 3 once powerful officers, now nothing more than convicted criminals. Outside, a swarm of reporters pushed forward, microphones in hand. "Do you have anything to say?" one journalist shouted. Greg, his face twisted in frustration, spat back. "This is a damn setup. We were framed." Jamal, watching from the steps of the courthouse, smirked. "You set yourselves up," he murmured. But as they were shoved into a waiting police van, Mike turned to Greg and whispered, "We're not done yet. We still have friends in high places." Greg's eyes darkened. "Damn right we do." Even behind bars, they weren't ready to give up. Not yet. Jamal knew the battle wasn't over. Corruption ran deeper than 3 officers. He had rattled the system, but the roots were still there, coiled in the shadows. Sitting in his office, he went over a new stack of files. Officers who had covered for Mike, Greg, and Tom. Detectives who had lost evidence. Judges who let guilty men walk free. He picked up his phone. "We're opening more cases." The city had celebrated a victory, but Jamal knew the real war had just begun. A month later, Mike, Greg, and Tom sat in their prison cell. The reality had finally settled in. They weren't getting out. The system that once protected them had now cast them aside. On the outside, Jamal stood in front of the precinct, speaking to a crowd. This isn't just about 3 officers. This is about every victim who was silenced, every family that suffered, every person who lost faith in justice. No more hiding. No more excuses. This city belongs to its people, not to corruption. The crowd erupted in applause. And as the sun set behind him, Chief Jamal Brooks knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.